Hey, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the University of Westminster and to the Centre for the Study of Democracy. I'm always surprised that on a Saturday afternoon we can get a decent crowd like this. Maybe you're trying to stay away from what else is out there in London at the moment and the crowd, so maybe this is the oasis of tranquility. I'm very delighted that we've got an event on this theme, which is institutionalizing participatory and deliberative democracy. I'm particularly delighted to be able to invite three great speakers. We'd like to take advantage. One of the great things about being in London is taking advantage of colleagues as they come through and thinking this will be a great person to build an event around. So we're delighted that after the first panel we're going to have a lecture and a Q&A with Leonardo Apalizza. For those of you who know anything about participation in Latin America, he's one of the real thinkers and writers and actors in that space. But before that, we're going to have a panel featuring an introduction from myself, but also Clodagh Harris, who's from Cork University, who's an expert on issues around deliberative mini-publics, in particular what's been happening in Ireland. I think some of the practice around citizens' assemblies, both in the way that they've played with the design and also had impact, is a story that many of us actually need to hear and haven't really heard to date. And we've also got Oliver Escobar, who's going to be talking about the development of participatory and deliberative institutions in Scotland. And again, one of the problems about being so London-centric is you don't listen to what's happening around the rest of the country. Recently, we ran an event around the Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations. No one in London knew there was a Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations, and that was in the Sustainability Policy Network. So it's really important that we bring these different voices together for conversations. What I thought it would be useful to do, though, is to give a short presentation around this issue of institutionalisation and some of the thinking that's been going on in academic circles around this. It's a term which is beginning to resonate, and it's that question of we kind of look at these cases that look particularly interesting, but we don't very often think about how participatory and deliberative innovations in institutions can be sustained over time. So this term has kind of emerged as one of those terms around, particularly around the thinking around deliberative systems as well. So I just wanted to introduce some of this, and this is by no means do I want to say, and this is the language we're going to use. What I'm offering is just some thoughts on institutionalisation in some way so that my colleagues don't have to talk that much about it and we can reflect back on it, but also as a way of locating ourselves. So what do I mean by institutionalisation? As I was thinking about this yesterday afternoon, a bit late, but and I was thinking, well, in terms of institutionalisation, we seem to be capturing a number of qualities. We don't need them all to be present, but these when people talk about institutionalisation, they typically mean at least one and usually two and sometimes three of the following things. One is the idea that participation is regularised, that it's not just a one-off event that just happens and then disappears, but actually there's a kind of regularisation of opportunities for engagement. Secondly, in relation to institutionalisation, we typically think about it in relation to coupling the participatory process with some form of decision making. That doesn't mean that the participatory process itself makes the final decision, but rather that there is a relationship between the participatory and deliberative practices and decision making. And finally, people would like to, at least from a normative perspective, hope that these processes then have some impact. Because you could couple with decision making and have no impact whatsoever. But most people who talk about institutionalisation are interested in that question of impact. So another way of saying this is in a more positive sense of saying, so how can, I guess this is the question that I think is at the basis of today's discussion, is how can we embed high quality and recurrent practices of participatory and or deliberative governance that move beyond the whim of political authorities, so not having to wait for political authorities to say participation would be a good thing. For moving beyond cherry picking of outputs, and what I mean by that is the idea that you have a deliberative process and then a government chooses the outputs it particularly likes to implement. Or finally, and I suppose cherry picking is one aspect of this, of co-options of the process in which participation is used to legitimate decisions that have already been made elsewhere. So I guess that, for me, these are the sorts of debates about, this is the sort of thing that we're looking for in term when we use the term institutionalization. In the discussions that follow, we're going to be focusing, I think, is my guess, knowing what people work on, and I know that Leonardo is going to take us beyond this as well, but I think we're going to be talking about two main forms of participation, which arguably come from two different traditions of activism, and again we can unpack some of this. The first is participatory budgeting, and participatory budgeting was very exciting for those of us in Europe to think about the way that in Latin America participatory processes have been established, which happened over time and dealt with significant public resources. So just as a sort of, I'm assuming most people in the room know what these things are, but I just thought it was useful that we did have a baseline on this. Leonardo is just producing a book which I think comes out later this month on Latin American practice. It's not just on PB, as he will explain in his presentation, but he suggests there are 4 characteristics of Latin American PB. The first is the idea that sovereignty is delegated to the people, and that not to a particular group of people, but the people, as in the particular population. But there's typically a combination of direct and elected forms of participation within that process. Importantly, it's self-regulated, i.e. the citizens are involved in defining the rules of that participation. They're not given those rules by public authority, but they actually create those rules through the process of doing PB. And typically PB is said to have the objective to invert priorities in the distribution of public goods. In other words, it's pro-poor. We tend to see the distribution of goods moving from richer to poorer within that society. Leonardo is fantastic on this stuff. I want to add a 5th thing, which I think is really critical, and from reading his work as well, is that I think one of the things that has meant that this has been recurrent and has been sustained over time is that actually it's not just about the participatory process and citizens, but it's also about what the state has done. And in those cities where PB has really been institutionalised, also true in those few cities where it's been institutionalised in Europe, is we've seen a degree of state administrative restructuring to enable that participation and to enable implementation. And I think that's really critical, and it's something I want to return to in a minute. When we move from Latin America to Europe, because all over Europe cities are doing PB, I think if we look at these criteria that Leonardo sets out, actually what we have mostly in Europe is a poor imitation of that. It's not to say it's not worth doing, but it's not, in many ways, it's not PB as we know it in Latin America. It's something different. Often we have relatively small budgets compared to the municipal budgets in Latin America, which are targeted specifically at poor communities to make decisions on issues that they'd like to prioritise. So it's pro-poor in one way, but it doesn't engage the city as a city. It just engages that poor community. And I think engaging a city as a city is a really critical factor of PB Latin America. I also think typically it lacks self-regulation. The rules are established by the sponsoring authority who say this is how you can make decisions, this is how that money is to be distributed. Obviously the ideas come from the citizens, but the rules of distribution have been already laid down. Very often it's not repetitive. In the UK, very often it's just a one-off thing, and maybe they remember it and do it again 5 years later. And typically it involves no administrative restructuring of the local state in the UK. It's usually money given to a poor community who administer that money, and then that's the end of it. So PB will be one of the participatory institutions that we'll be looking at in this discussion. And what's been interesting, I think, and Leonardo will tell us more about this hopefully in his lecture, no pressure Leonardo, is that in those cities like Porto Alegre that we hold up as the sort of canonical cases, actually over the last decade or so, although what they do is still impressive, it's not as impressive as it was. It has been, to a certain degree, manipulated and co-opted by the local state, as the original sponsors of PB have moved on and different parties have taken over. So actually, the real PB action is happening in other cities, I believe. The other thing I think we'll be looking at, is deliberative mini-publics. And this is the use of stratified, randomly selected groups of citizens who are facilitated to learn about, deliberate and make decisions on a particular issue. So I've just finished with some colleagues working on the Citizens' Assembly on Brexit, which unfortunately had almost no media attention whatsoever. But, these things happen, unfortunately. And this is what the Irish have been doing in terms of their Citizens' Assemblies focusing on constitutional issues. I'll mention that in a second. To be honest, though, while there's been a proliferation, I don't even think that was right, but it's close, of mini-publics, they've typically been one-off, and they've typically been advisory. They've typically been experimental, and they lack kind of political bite and political influence. But of course, there are enough examples where they have had significant political effect or been given a significant political role that it keeps us interested, and it makes it clear that these things could be used more extensively. So the famous case is the British Columbia Citizens' Assembly, which was coupled with a binding referendum. So in my view, that's a kind of form of institutionalisation. There was a mini-public, followed by a binding form of public engagement. It was just one-off. It hasn't happened. It happened twice in British Columbia, but it isn't something they've repeated very often. But it's a way of institutionalising that mini-public within the political process. I think the most interesting thing that's happening over in the Americas at the moment with this is the Citizens Initiative Review, where mini-publics are inserted in the middle of citizens' initiative processes. So citizens put forward proposals. If they can get enough signatures, they go to a binding referendum. Well, in Oregon now, a certain number of those now have a mini-public in them, in which they look at the issue that has been going to be put on the binding ballot and give advice to citizens about the pros and cons of that issue. So it's, if you like, providing independent information to citizens who are then going to vote. Many people thought something like that would have been a good idea in the Brexit process, of actually having a Citizens' Assembly try and give some balanced perspective on this. We'll hear much more about this from Clodagh, but one of the really interesting innovations in Ireland was the idea of bringing politicians into that assembly to become members. So it's 66 randomly selected members and 33 politicians. Interestingly, they've reverted back now to a 99 citizen-only assembly. So they've done this a couple of times on major constitutional issues. So in all of these cases, I think these are real cases where we see an institutionalisation of deliberative mini-publics. And I think it's interesting to note that the next Real Utopias collection by Olin Wright is going to be, which is very influential for many of us, is going to be on the idea of legislation by lot, or legislatures by lot, the idea of randomly selected assemblies replacing one or both of the legislatures. So this is clearly an idea with form, if people like the Real Utopias are picking it up, but it's a really interesting area for thinking about what this might look like institutionalised. And Clodagh will be telling us much more about what it means in Ireland and what it has meant. So just a couple of conceptual things that have come out of the literature recently, just to kind of place us. And there'll be terms that people use, I think, some people will use in this discussion. And one of them is this idea of, if you're going to think about institutionalisation, you've got to be thinking about how you design the relationship between the participatory institution and political authorities. And I should, in some ways, apologise that I am, in this session, focusing on the institutionalisation in relation to political decision-making. We could be thinking about it in economic institutions, we could be thinking about it within social movements, but we're particularly in this session talking about public authorities. This has become a really important idea within debates on deliberative democracy, and there's lots of debates, including people in this room, who have been debating around whether tight coupling is good, or whether it should be loose coupling, or whether it should be decoupled, and coupling seems to be the favourite term at the moment. And worries about tight coupling of institutions might lead to co-option, but then it might have impact, and this is the kind of Irish debate, really interesting. How do you ensure critical distance? There's a whole debate going on within the deliberative systems literature. One of the things that I think is interesting about this literature is that my sense is, and I may or may not be right here, has this been very influenced about the debate about how you link mini-publics to decision making? Many of the deliberative systems people, myself included, have a background of focusing on mini-publics. And mini-publics are a very particular form of institution. And within those models, the state institutions remain very much the same. But if we were to focus in Latin America, I'm going to sell Leonardo's book again, you see, because he focuses on. He pays me every time I mention it. Is that for them, they're not talking about these kind of mini publics that we very often focus on in Europe and the United States, but in these more radical kind of participatory budgeting, policy councils, and other sorts of organisations, in which you also see state restructuring as part of that process of engagement. And it strikes me that's a very different way about thinking about coupling. It means the state is reforming itself as well as is reforming its own structures and practices. And it is interesting that when I talk to my Latin American friends, they want to talk much more about participatory systems and not about deliberative systems. I think there's a very interesting thing that we may pick up in the discussions today, that institutionalization looks different if you're looking from a deliberative systems position than if you're looking from a participatory systems position. We develop that perhaps later, or we may not go back to it at all. So I think this is the final slide. No, two more slides. So just a couple of slides. One is thinking about how we might think about approaching institutionalization. And if we take Latin American examples, we see constitutional codification in some constitutions, such as in Brazil and Bolivia. There is an argument that this is all well and good, but it underspecifies the form that participation should take. So it puts a constitutional argument, a constitutional status on participation, but then what follows from that is an interesting question. So to become more specific, we see things like the participation laws in Bolivia, where 20% of central government revenue goes to local communities, and there's been establishment of monitoring committees in that. We also see participation laws in countries like in Tuscany, for example, where there are requirements for engagement under certain conditions. And then we see these development of what Laurence Baer has called APOPs, which is probably the most complicated acronym within participatory studies at the moment, which is Autonomous Public Organisations Charged with Promoting Public Participation. Just rolls off the tongue. But these are an interesting group of institutions. There aren't many of them around the world. And they are independent organisations which are charged by government to ensure that practices of participatory governance happen around particular areas of policy when particular conditions are in place. It could be particular types of development, it could be particular types of resources that are about to be spent. Sometimes it's around environmental impact assessment. And these are two or three examples. Quebec Environmental Public Hearings Board, the Tuscan Participatory Authority, the former Danish Board of Technology that used to run consensus conferences. All of these would fit under that designation of APOPs. And these are all really interesting ideas about what's the institutional and legal infrastructure that needs to be in place in order to see institutionalisation happen. And again, these might be themes that we want to bring out. So finally, I just wanted to leave you with some thoughts on dilemmas. And obviously the first one is, how do we overcome the kind of vulnerabilities that we know are there with participatory democratic institutions? How do we avoid the issue of the state impeding participation, impeding deliberation, in terms of ignoring it or cherry-picking it or co-opting? So that leads to this question. These are all the same question, just answered in different ways. How do we ensure a degree of autonomy and sustainability, importantly, beyond the lifetime of those people who established the process? When that state sponsor is no longer in power, how do we ensure that we can restore and rejuvenate and sustain that participatory process? Because so much of this seems to hinge on particularly favourable leadership. Although it looks as though one can institutionalise, put things in place over time perhaps, in order to allow that autonomy and that sustainability. My final question, I guess, is this interesting question down here, which is about, I think for those of us in Europe, this isn't a question we've been really dealing with, but for those from Latin America, it's been really pertinent, which is how do we conceptualise and sustain the state side of participatory politics? How do we think about what does the state, how should we be thinking about restructuring activities and practices and institutions of the state in order that they can support and sustain participatory processes over time? So on that note, I'm just going to end you and say and pass you over to two people who are now going to be very much more specific and much more grounded in what they're going to say around this. And first of all, if Clodagh, sorry, we've only got one of these mics, so we're going to have to pop in.